Hello everyone and welcome back to another Bentley Davey Tutors video. Today we are looking at Act 2. This is part 2 of 5 of our Macbeth series. And sorry the last one dragged on so long. This one should be shorter. So last time we had 7 scenes. This time we have 4 scenes. And obviously, as I mentioned last time, the length of each scene does differ a bit. But this one should be shorter. Should be. Don't quote me on that. But yeah, I'm hoping to get it done in under 15 minutes maybe. But I will have this time timestamps in the description if I can't do the cool thing where they put it in the middle of the video. I don't really know how to do that. But anyway, yeah, there will be timestamps in the description so you can go from scene to scene in case you have expert knowledge of, say, Act 2, Scene 1, but need some revision on Act 2, Scene 3. So, we're going to start off with Act 2, Scene 1, as I just said. So, if you don't know where we left off, I could be pretty dog and just say, well, go just watch the other video. No, but we left off with Macbeth and Lady Macbeth having their whole argument as to whether or not they should kill Duncan, and they still didn't really come to that good of a conclusion. But anyway, it seemed as though Lady Macbeth was winning. Okay, so we got Act 2, Scene 1. So the context here, we start off with Fleance and Banquo. Fleance is Banquo's son, talking with Macbeth. And so Banquo explains that the king is asleep and has had a great time here staying at Macbeth's house today. And then Banquo states as well that he dreamt of the 3 weird sisters. And Macbeth responds bluntly, I think not of them, which is complete lies because he's been basically consumed by them since he originally saw them. Then Macbeth asks Banquo if he will be on his side when the time comes. Bit of a dodgy question. It makes Macbeth seem kind of dodgy, which he is. And the quote there is, if you shall cleave to my consent when 'tis, it shall make honour for you. Banquo responds basically by saying that he's not going to pick a side. He says, like, if you can do it, but still keep my bosom franchised and allegiance clear, which is basically, I'll do it, but I'm not picking a side. So then we've got the next thing. This scene also has the, is this a dagger I see before me speech. So in this soliloquy, Macbeth is going off to kill Duncan because he's decided now that he's got to do it. And he sees a dagger before him, just floating up in the air. It's not a real dagger. It's basically a hallucination. And he realizes that it's the exact dagger that he's planning on using to kill old mate Duncan. And so this can either be seen as an omen by the witches or as a hallucination that he is having even before he's killed Duncan, which is an image to the fact that he will go mad. And so some quotes he uses is, I see thee, firstly. These words are repeated. He says, I see thee not, I see thee still. He says a bunch of other stuff. And so the idea of sight is important to him as he believes that it's the most concrete proof of something being real. So the fact that he's seeing it, but he thinks it's not actually real, is very confronting to him. He calls it a fatal vision, which is a nice double entendre, because fatal being an indication of death, as in like fatal blow, or of destiny, as in fate. So it's quite nice. And then he says, thou marshalst me the way that I was going. So this is basically saying that the dagger is pointing him in the direction that he was already going, as if edging him on to keep going. He also says bloody business. This is a euphemism for how he will now go and kill Duncan. Euphemism is where they're using overly simplistic language to depict something that's quite, like, actually a bit more serious or a bit bigger than they sort of make it seem. So that's where bloody business comes in. Then he also says nature seems dead, which forebodes the idea again that I explained last video of the natural order collapsing after the king is killed. They also, Lady Macbeth and Macbeth then get a bit of an auditory obsession. They become overly paranoid to stuff that is a noise. For example, after they've killed Duncan, there's like, I heard the owl creak and the crickets cry, and they're all paranoid because they're like, don't be somebody coming to catch me. And then Macbeth says, thy very stones prate, which means the stones are gossiping, basically. And he's personifying the stones and nature and saying that they are talking about him and talking about what he's done. And then he ends off his whole little discussion and mind battle with himself with, I go and it is done. This is a really nice quote because it's super simplistic. And it sort of is like he's been spending so much time thinking about this and that and having an internal battle with what he should do, and he ends it with "I go and it is done," and that's all he says. And then he decides to go and kill Duncan, and so he does that, and that takes us to Act 2, Scene 2. So the context here is that Duncan gets killed off stage because if we think back to Elizabethan times, Duncan or the king being killed on stage, especially when the king is in the audience, would be one of the most abhorrent things that you could put in a play. So Shakespeare makes the choice to not kill Duncan on stage. So for Act 2, Scene 2, Lady Macbeth enters and she gives some antithesis. So she says, "What made me drunk hath made me bold, and what hath quenched me hath given me fire." She's basically saying, like, what was a weakness before has now made me stronger. They yell "hark, peace," and they have major paranoia, as I said before, because they hear an owl cry as though it's terrified because the natural order has now been taken apart. Lady Macbeth says that had he not resembled my father as he slept, I had done it. She's basically saying, if Duncan didn't look like my dad when he was sleeping, I would have killed him myself. Lady Macbeth and Macbeth then talk in stickamithia, which is shared sentences. They are both scared and they're shocked, and their speaking pretty much falls apart. So it's stuff where they're like, I don't have any examples, so I should have been more prepared. But it's where they're like in the middle of a line of like saying something, and then the other one will just go like "hark" or something like that. Basically, their whole speech falls apart because of how scared they are. And then they together are in fear and they are in paranoia. And so Lady Macbeth becomes very accusatory. She says age of childhood, again belittling Macbeth's manhood. And in terms of the murder of Duncan, we get a big schism in their relationship. So what we see is that Macbeth feels instantly regretful and guilty. He calls it a sorry sight, and he uses a quote that I really, really like, which is right at the end of the scene. He says, "Wake Duncan with thy knocking, I would thou couldst." This is basically him saying, if I could, I wish I could wake. So they hear some big knocks on the door, which is basically some people trying to come in, which I'll touch on in a second. But Macbeth's basically saying, Duncan, I wish I could wake you up with that knocking. But Lady Macbeth feels the opposite. She thinks, well, we shouldn't have any remorse for it. And she again belittles his manhood and says, a foolish thought to say a sorry sight. She calls him a bit of a fool. Then we hear a big knock knock. So a harsh knock echoes around the theatre to break up the tension in the audience. And then Macbeth then says that we should retire to our chambers because somebody's now at the door. Lady Macbeth then states, a little water clears us of this deed.
And would you look at that? Everybody's favourite voiceover artist is back. Jez's voiceover here. I would just like to apologise for how shockingly out of chronological order that section is. Basically, how it actually works is all the sort of stuff about a little water clears us of this deed happens before they say the quote, "Wake Duncan with thy knocking, I would thou couldst," is actually pretty much the final quote of that scene. So just ignore me there.
This is a super ironic bit of the play, as later, all the way in Act 5, which will be in the 5th video, Lady Macbeth ends up sleepwalking and going insane because she feels as though she can't get the blood off her hands. So she's saying here, a little water clears us of this deed, gets the blood off her hands. Nobody thinks it's us. Macbeth responds with, as I said before, "Wake Duncan with thy knocking, I would thou couldst." Macbeth is now desperate and he has instant regret. So we hear a couple of things here from Macbeth. So there's two things. He can't say amen, and then also there's the sleep motif. So firstly, after Macbeth kills Duncan, he accidentally wakes up the two people in the next chambers, but they decide to not really do anything. They're like, that's fine. So they just decide to pray. And then when they finish the prayers, he finds out that he can't say amen. And the quote goes, "But wherefore I could not pronounce amen." And so this really eats him up inside, and Lady Macbeth is dismissive of this and just says these deeds must not be thought. But basically Macbeth is really eaten up by the fact that he can't finish prayer. And so then we've got the sleep motif. These are some nice quotes in here. They're quite repetitive, but yeah, they're good. It's "Sleep no more, Macbeth doth murder sleep, and then Glamis hath murdered sleep, and therefore Cawdor shall sleep no more, Macbeth shall sleep no more." Macbeth knows that now that after he has killed Duncan, he will never be able to sleep again, which means that he won't be able to rest his mind, which becomes really important for both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, the idea of being able to rest. And so that's all we've got for Act 2, Scene 3, but we do still have 2 more scenes. One of these scenes I did a bit differently in my notes. We got some questions, and I answered the questions for the notes for this section. So what I'll do is I will try and take some analysis out of that. So Act 2, Scene 3, that's the Porter scene. Porter scene is quite famous. It's the comic relief in Macbeth. It's where the porter, which is the guy who basically opens the door, jokes around with himself for a little bit about as though he was the porter to hell. So he had the door to hell. And so that's basically meant to be the funny bit for the audience. It doesn't sound as funny for today's audiences, but yeah, for back then, that was the comic relief of the play. So the first thing to look at is what was the actual role of the porter here. So yeah, as I said, the porter has a lot of roles. The porter has to cut the tension because it's huge at this point. Like, the Macbeths, they've just committed regicide. They're all on edge. The audience is on edge. Everybody's on edge. So they're trying to cut that and also provide comic relief and be more entertaining for the audience. Finally, it's quite ironic because this porter is speaking about being basically the guy who lets people into hell, and Macbeth has now realised that him and Lady Macbeth will be going to hell because, of what they've done. And so then the Porter scene ends, and it turns out that Macduff and Lennox and some of the other lords were there. And so Lennox actually reveals to us a bunch of stuff about the disruption of the natural order, as I've spoken about a bit, including the wind blowing down chimneys, the owls made noises, and the earth shook. Yeah, the earth shook. And then we also hear that, Duncan's horses ate each other. And so then Macbeth... So Macbeth speaks to the lords after they discuss that. After they discover that Duncan's died, he gives basically a sorrow statement, where he's basically waffling about the fact that he's so sad that Duncan's dead. He gives the quote, "Had I died an hour before this chance, I had lived a blessed life." He's basically saying, if I died before I'd found out Duncan was dead, then I would have been all happy. Quite dodgy because he was the one who actually killed Duncan. But that's all right. It's not. Macbeth, we do think, though, that Macbeth may have actually had quite a bit of remorse here, because we know that he was remorseful, but we do actually think that potentially these statements from Macbeth were genuine. But then Malcolm and Donalbain at the end of the scene realise that there are daggers in men's smiles. And so, Malcolm and Donalbain are the King Duncan's sons, and he realises that it's not safe for them to be in Scotland anymore. So they actually flee to England. But a big thing that happens to Macbeth, which is a bit unfortunate, is once everybody realises that... once everybody shows up at Macbeth's castle, Macduff discovers that King Duncan's dead. Like, oh my goodness, he's dead. And Macbeth's like, what? I had no idea about this. So then they're all like, oh, who could have done it? And then Macbeth just comes out like a bit later and is like, oh, it was the guards. I killed them. I knew they'd done it, so I killed them. And then they're like, well, how did you know they'd killed Duncan if you didn't know he was dead? And so this is eventually what leads everybody to realise that it was actually Macbeth who was being pretty dodgy and who killed Duncan. But yeah, honestly, quite a poor effort from Macbeth in terms of not getting caught. Like, that's not really high quality. But anyway, that takes us on to Act 2, Scene 4. So we're up to the context of the scene for Act 2, Scene 4. So Ross speaks with an old man, basically, about the breakdown of the natural order here. They now know that Duncan is dead, so they have a good explanation as to why everything's gone all chaotic. So Macduff enters and explains that the guards did the deed, but Malcolm and Donalbain fled, which makes them now a suspect. We think that Macduff probably suspects Macbeth did it, but hasn't actually said it yet because he doesn't want to, get anybody into trouble for anything. And then Macduff also talks about going to Fife instead of Scone. So Macbeth was going to be coronated at Scone, and Macduff is the Thane of Fife, but he's like, well, I'm sort of just going to go home. I don't like this Macbeth guy anymore. And so now onto the language of this scene and some quote analysis. We hear, "'Tis unnatural, even like the deed that's done." This is basically saying that natural was very strange, like the actual killing of the king. That was quite strange. And then there's the quote that nature was at war with mankind. Again, this reveals that nature was very, very unhappy at the fact that Duncan was now dead. "'Tis said they ate each other." Again, this is talking about Duncan's horses eating and killing each other after Duncan had died. We then hear "thriftless ambition that will raven up thine own life's means." And so this is where Ross is explaining that ambition is guilty, and he employs pathetic fallacy to explain that ambition can pretty much kill life. And then finally, we hear a bit of a clothing motif, which is, "Last our old robes sit easier than our new." Macduff feels uncomfortable with his new situation, and he feels as though he was a lot better and a lot happier before Duncan had died, which is probably fair enough. So that's all we had for Act 2. It was quite short, as I said. Don't know how long this video has been now, but probably a while. But thank you. Part 3, which will be the Act 3, will come out very shortly. Hope you enjoyed. Leave a like if you did like the video, and thank you, and bye.